So good afternoon, everybody. Today's, as Dr. McNeil said, part of the organizational profile we'll focus on is competitive position and understanding competitive changes, which I think is closely tied to the purpose of the Sterling Management Framework, which is a non-prescriptive management framework, which helps an organization understands how they can improve their results and increase their competitive position in the marketplace. So if we look at the competitive position or a competitive environment, we'll talk about competitive position and competitive changes today, which in this case, again, for every organization, no matter what the size, should know what their competitive position is within the marketplace so they can maintain that position. And a lot of people are saying that the competitive position is probably one of the most important factors that determines an organization's long-term profitability or long-term sustainability. So if you think of competitive position, Dr. Deming defined quality as providing a service or product for a customer at a price that they're willing to pay for. So part of that competitive positioning is understanding your consumer, understanding their perceptions of quality and price, and then understanding those requirements, and then defining your niche in the marketplace. So if you think about automobiles, I worked at the Saturn Corporation, and if you think of the Saturn automobile, the competitors were really Toyota, Honda, and Nissan. And that became evident to Saturn when the customers or the consumer who normally would buy a Saturn automobile, as their families grew, the feedback was the Saturn automobile was not large enough because of the size of their family. But instead of those customers purchasing another GM automobile, they would go to a Toyota or Honda or Nissan. And in order for Saturn to maintain that market segment, they would have to build a little larger automobile based on the niche that they were trying to carve out and the customer requirements that they had identified. But that lets you know the level of customer requirements and understanding those requirements and the competitive position that you have to build in the marketplace to be able to carve out that niche. It goes right along with the marketing strategy. So in order for us to understand how to communicate with those customers, we need to really understand our competitive position in the marketplace and what differentiates us from the customer. So with that being said, you need to be able to understand your customers' strengths and weaknesses, and then how your strengths and weaknesses can address a particular gap. And then you can carve out some space in the marketplace there and then communicate that to the customers. And you want to always be assessing your competitors and what your customers' requirements are so that you can maintain that, because as we know, those customers' perceptions change over time and they evolve. And for those high-performing organizations, really they stay just a little bit ahead of those customer evolutions so they can maintain that competitive position in the marketplace. One of the tools that we can use for competitive analysis is SWOT analysis within our strategic planning process. So competitive analysis is a very important step, as we talked about, for the business, knowing what those strengths and weaknesses and challenges are, not only for our competitors, but also for our product, will help us maintain that niche within the marketplace. So competitive analysis is that way will allow us to circulate that information throughout the organization and to our stakeholders and let us understand what niche or where our place is within the marketplace. Another tool that we could also use here to document the competitive position is, for those of you familiar with quality, is the House of Quality. Once you compare your product or service to those competitors and those requirements, then you know where your niche is based off of that House of Quality. It provides you that information, and normally we want to use those in the design of those products and services so we can make sure we understand what the competitive marketplace is and which customer types and requirements that we want to make sure that we're the leader in that area. So if you think about the criteria here for the profile tells us that we want to know our competitors, right? So next week we'll talk about the second part or the last part of this area, which is comparative data. So how do we know how we're performing? That means we've got comparative data. Sources of that comparative data and competitive data could be trade, depending on the industry, trade magazines, conferences, of course, Baldrige applications. We want to make sure that we're seeking that information as much as possible because that'll drive our decision-making process. And it'll drive, hopefully, our core competencies, because hopefully those core competencies is something where we have an advantage in the marketplace. And when people think of those particular services and products, then they're going to think of us if we've carved out that niche. And then those strategic challenges, we want to make sure we understand where our strategic challenges is, and definitely those strategic advantages, because just because we have a strategic advantage today, that don't mean we can maintain that without continually improving and evolving our products and services. We can think back in history where a lot of products or services have become obsolete because of competition, because of disruptions. If we think of the cell phone industry, everybody in 2006, 2007, if you worked for the government, had a BlackBerry, and then Apple came along, and pretty much that disruption, now Motorola and those producers lost that product because of that competitive position, or that competitor came along and kind of transformed the marketplace. Others are disruptions. So understanding those challenges and advantages will help us prepare for those disruptions. Of course, the obvious one now is COVID. When COVID came along, again, a lot of organizations unfortunately went out of business because they wasn't resilient or they couldn't adapt there. They didn't plan for that disruptions. Others transformed their business. So if you think of retail, a lot of retail organizations went from brick and mortar to more of an online service, just so they could evolve and maintain their business throughout that organization. So if you think of competitive position, in summary, we have to make sure that we understand our competitors. I know a lot of times we get feedback that there is no comparative data or there is no competition. But even if that may be the case, that doesn't mean one may not show up tomorrow. So we got to make sure that we're planning for now and the future, and we're continually trying to evolve and remain resilient throughout our organization. That ends our discussion for the day. Any questions?
Excellent, Sampson. You got me busy here. I've been writing lots of notes, lots of bullets. So let me go through my summary and then we'll open it up for questions. The first bullet I have is define how to differentiate your organization in the marketplace to create a unique niche. And you really honed in on that niche for your product or your service offerings in the marketplace. And then be clear on the benefit and desired position in the marketplace that you're focusing on. Define the organization's core competency. Also determine a marketing strategy to differentiate your products and services from competitors. Consider that price and value, as you said. Develop a good approach for creating a competitive analysis, identifying who your competitors are and who your customers are. And then leverage this to define a desired focus in the industry. And once you have that focus, make sure to leverage this knowledge to plan for any unexpected disruptions that may occur. Some of the tools that you cited that I listed were consider to use for competitive positioning and ensuring that your advantage is intact as things change would be competitive analysis, of course, benchmarking, SWOT, the house of quality, you referenced that, and then also really going back and calibrating your organizational strategic challenges and your strategic advantages. And that's what I got. That was very good session, a lot jam-packed in a very short period of time. So thank you for that. Some of the questions I've got, Let's see. First one, can you provide an example of a best-in-class application of a competitive analysis?
Yeah, my best example goes back to my automobile days, and down at the tech center in Detroit. GM would purchase competitors' automobiles, and they would have a group of engineers and scientists which would really reverse engineer those products. So they would go through, they would test them, they would measure them, and then they would compare them to the current product that GM had to see where maybe the competitor had an advantage in a particular product, right? So they would try to reverse engineer to see that. So that's one of the best in class. So really understanding your competitor's product and services and comparing it to your existing products and services and see where the advantages and maybe challenges are.
Yeah, and that's a great example in the manufacturing of the product area. And I would think that in service area, you can kind of do the same thing through secret shoppers, right?
Right, right.
And bring back that intelligence around that experience you get for a service type of interesting. I never realized that they did that in the car industry, but it does make sense. What sources can be used to identify competitors and define a best-in-class competitive position?
So again, depending on the industry, sometimes you have trade shows where you can go and look at the products and services for some of the competitors, or where there are publications, whether it's journal publications or magazines, where people talk about their products and services. Of course, benchmarking. In some organizations, they do allow you to benchmark or tour the facility and services. And of course, the Baldrige process itself, that's what it was kind of developed for, to identify those leaders in the industry so other organizations can kind of role model their processes and services after.
Great. Okay, so we have a question. Often we see organizations struggle to define their core competency. What would be a good tool to define an organization's true core competencies?
That is a good question. So when I consult, that's the work that we do. It depends on the leadership and the niche that we're trying to create. So I would say once we've identified a gap in the marketplace, then we'll have to try to invest and get resources there to try to fill that gap within the marketplace. I always say we can't be everything for everybody. So a lot of organizations, they try to be good at a lot of things, but you want to try to narrow down your focus and prioritize on those few things, as Baldrige says, those 2 or 3 things that we're going to be good at. Now, the house of quality, part of that is, if you look at the roof there, is developing those features of your product or service and then comparing that to your competitors' products and services. And then what you're trying to do is identify an area where your product and services, the features there are better than for the competitors. And from that, you can develop what your core competencies are. For instance, if it's automobile, maybe we want to, have the most horsepower, right? So when we compare this vehicle to our competitors, we will make sure that we create a vehicle that has the most horsepower. So that will become kind of our core competencies or our niche in the marketplace.
Yeah, and a core competency is something that we don't want to outsource to any vendors or third parties, right? Because we want to keep that close. That's intelligent knowledge that, give us that competitive advantage, right, Sampson?
Correct. Yeah. So when we determine what we do internal and external, having a good handle on our core competencies will make that decision easy. And as Bob talked about last week, and your partners and collaborators, that's where we want to make sure that we have partners and collaborators where we know what their core competencies are and what our core competencies are, and then we can work in that partnership to better supply our customer expectations and meet those needs.
Awesome. All right, well, we are at time. Appreciate that, Dr. Gholston. Thank you so much for a very insightful session.